In today's fast-paced world, employers face a common challenge: employee stress and burnout. Keeping your team motivated and productive when their stress levels are high is a constant struggle. But there's a solution. Introducing Awaken Pittsburgh's Mindful Connections for Workplace Wellness series. Our program helps reduce stress and burnout, fostering healthier, happier workplaces. Transform your workplace culture and unleash your team's full potential with Awaken Pittsburgh. Reach out today for more information.
Hello friends, my name is Stephanie Romero and I am the founder and executive director of Awaken Pittsburgh. I want to welcome you to our podcast, The Ripple Effect. Awaken Pittsburgh is a nonprofit dedicated to fostering well-being, empathy, and compassion for all by teaching and encouraging mindfulness and meditation practices. I also want to take a moment to let you know that Awaken Pittsburgh offers many other opportunities for practice and connection. For example, you can join our online community, which features a space to more deeply explore the topics we cover with our guests. We have weekly posts to spark thought, practice, and reflection. I hope you will come join us to explore, connect with others, and deepen your practice. You can find out more at awakenpittsburgh.org. Welcome to the Ripple Effect podcast. Our guest this episode is Dr. Alice Fox Thompson. Alice is the co-founder of Visible Hands Collaborative, a fourth-year psychiatry resident at the University of Texas, Austin, and a second-year APAF Public Psychiatry Fellow. Before graduating from medical school at the Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine, Alice received her Bachelor of Arts from Bates College with a degree in political science, and worked in advocacy and community organizing in Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh, PA. She's passionate about integrating her experience building meaningful community spaces into her future public and community psychiatry practice. I'm very excited to have a conversation with Alice today. Alice, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really happy to have this chance to get to know you more deeply and hear a little bit about your story, because it is an interesting story. For folks listening, Alice discovered this thing called Integrative Community Therapy, and I'd love to just hear about how you came upon it.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I really want to thank you, Stephanie, for having me on and for giving me the opportunity to talk about integrative community therapy today. So I like to describe my sort of uncovering of integrative community therapy as the product of sort of deep diving to the bottom of the internet. But it really all started when my husband and I, now husband, at the time we were, I think we were engaged, we were planning to take a year to go abroad. He actually studies Brazilian political science. And so one of our plans at that time, I was in medical school, but we were going to take a year off. He was going to go, we were going to go together to Brazil. He was going to work on his dissertation there, and I would be there as well. And I was really interested in psychiatry at the time. I was planning on applying to psychiatry residencies. And so my idea was, while he was working on his dissertation in Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, that I would go and try to find, a psychiatrist that I could go learn about the Brazilian healthcare system with. And so we had these really grand plans and we were so excited. And then this was, I believe, February of 2020. And so I believe about a month after we had started sort of like really taking these plans seriously, COVID happened and everything shut down. And we had sort of this like optimism of, still being able to go on this adventure. And then, as we all know, the pandemic sort of played out as it did. And so we ended up not going to Brazil for a year, unfortunately. And what we did instead was stayed in our house. I did end up taking a year off from medical school at the time. And so, was looking for some sort of way to integrate some of the like cultural aspects of what I had, heard about in Brazil, learned about sort of peripherally while I was doing some research around what I would do there. And my dad, actually, Ken, had mentioned to me, like, oh, I was at this conference one time and I heard about this cool thing. It's called like community therapy or something, but like, I don't know anything about it. So like, do with that what you will. I don't know if it would take you anywhere or if that's something that you'd be interested in. So it's like, okay, cool. I'll check into it. And I started to look for this model. It's community therapy, but then I found out it was like integrative community therapy. And then I started reading about the sort of implementation and this history of this style of dialogue that had come out of Brazil. And it's just like anything I could find on the internet, right? Because there was like, I couldn't be out talking to people. And so I found actually a website that was the European Association of Integrative Community Therapy. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I can find somebody who speaks English or some sort of connection here to learn more, because what I had read about, sort of the philosophical basis of integrative community therapy was really interesting to me. It was based on like Paulo Freire and sort of like native understandings of how community comes together. And so it was like stuff that I was just kind of like, that sounds really cool and, interesting. I'd like to learn more. And I had a lot of time on my hands. So I was, looking through this European Association of ICT website, and they had a flyer actually for a virtual integrative community therapy round that was happening every week virtually for basically in response to the pandemic. And it was based out of Switzerland. Geneva, Switzerland, which I later learned is where one of the creator, Dr. Barreto's closest sort of trainees, Ricardo Rodari, moved to Geneva, Switzerland after being trained in the model and started to spread it all over Switzerland. And so he started in Geneva. And so he was running these sessions and he was using them to actually train facilitators in the method while also providing a supportive dialogic therapeutic space for people to talk about sort of like all of the things that are going on internationally in response to the pandemic. And so I found this flyer, not knowing any of that at the time. And I emailed Ricardo and I said, hey, is it okay if I join these sessions? Like, are they in English? Like, is it, at what time is, like, is that okay? I'm just a stranger. I just found you. And he was like, yes, please join. Like, we largely do it in English. We usually do it in like the evenings, afternoons or evenings. So you probably be able to join in the morning. Please, very enthusiastic, very warm welcome. And so I did, I started to join, and the group at the time, it would vary from like, I would say like 10 to 15 people, mostly the same people each week. And I think I met with them for about 6 weeks straight. So we would meet every like Tuesday morning. And that was where I got my first exposure to ICT. And it was so incredible. First of all of the participants were from a different country. So there was Ricardo and Megan Brown, who were both in Switzerland, but there was someone from Scotland, someone from Sweden. We had a participant from France, from Italy, sometimes a member from China. And myself from the US, a couple of different people actually from across the US would join at different times. And so really just like this incredible connection to a bunch of people who I would never have met otherwise. And then, the conversations that we were having, I just found to be so profoundly moving, and, about really hard things that even in the spaces where I was, or even in the virtual spaces where I was going at the time, we really weren't getting to that level of depth of like emotional experience in relation to the pandemic, or in relation to the George Floyd protests, and sort of like a lot of the like political strife that was happening at the time. And so after 6 weeks of doing this work, and like, going through sessions where I was like crying pretty consistently, in a good way, right? Like emotional release, feeling like very connected to people who were across oceans from me. I was very, very impressed with the model. And so I started to shift from saying to myself, like, I'm really benefiting from this and I really love this experience, to how can I start to provide an experience like this for people that I know, or for communities in the US. And so that's really where we kind of like the momentum came from. And, luckily, because Ricardo was so close with Dr. Barreto, he made the connection for us to meet with Dr. Barreto. And it was in conversations with him that Ken and I actually came up with this, model to do a virtual online training in the midst of the pandemic. First English language, first virtual training that they have ever done for integrative community therapy. So that's where it all started.
Well, that's an amazing story. So yeah, how did you get to the point where you were like, we're gonna start a nonprofit and we want to bring this on a larger scale to Pittsburgh? Which, for folks listening, Alice and her dad Ken and some other supportive folks started Visible Hands Collaborative, which is a 501c3 nonprofit here in the US, based in Pittsburgh, that has been working to bring ICT to folks here. Yeah.
So I think it's sort of a combination of like really persuasive and engaging dialogue with Dr. Barreto and his team in Brazil, and just some level of dumb luck in terms of being able to find like some resources that allowed us to pursue this. And then I think mixed with that was this moment of global trauma that really demonstrated a huge gap, a perceived gap in what our systems in the US have the capacity and the ability to provide for people when like global atrocities happen, right? And so we have sort of always come from this place of like, we live in the US in a socio-political cultural environment that emphasizes and relies heavily on individuality. And this was the opposite of that. It was really bringing in a model that only reinforces the value and the strength and power of coming together in community, and how that can be such a healing force in light of these like really devastating you know, natural disasters, political disasters, pandemics, that sort of thing. And so, you know, I think more than anything, what motivated us was just being in the middle of this pandemic and feeling how heavy it was for everyone and how people were really, really suffering and not finding the resources that they needed to get through it.
Yeah, and I am really seeing the parallel between what you just described as our collective experience in the pandemic and the way that ICT was born in Brazil. So it's kind of making me want to ask you to just describe briefly, like, why did Dr. Barreto decide to start or design this modality?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, you know, this is the best story that ICT has to offer. So, in the like late 1970s, early 1980s, there was a huge drought in the sort of like inner regional areas in Brazil. And so a bunch of migrants had to move from the agricultural settings to the coastal settings where the cities were. And with that move, sort of like this, like, I would call it a level of like internal refugee creation. You know, the cities couldn't accommodate in terms of housing, and the migrants were incredibly poor. And so they started to set up these, what they call favelas, or, you know, in the US would be like roughly translated to like a shanty town. And so, you know, building entire neighborhoods from like scraps of, you know, cardboard and, you know, wood that's sort of like laid around, and just like putting together these homes and these like massive neighborhood settings that were technically illegal settlements. And so the police actually would come through and just destroy all the homes that had been built. And then the migrants would just rebuild them. And this was sort of this ongoing process that was going on. And so in the midst of this like really devastating poverty that these communities were experiencing, Dr. Barreto's brother actually was a human rights lawyer, and he would go into these settings and work with people around their, you know, like legal challenges. And he invited Dr. Barreto, who is he's an anthropologist and a psychiatrist by training. And so he invited Dr. Barreto to start seeing community members in these favelas, because he just perceived that there was so much distress, you know, mental distress, emotional distress related to everything that they were facing, all the challenges that they were facing. And so Dr. Barreto was like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll come meet all these people. And so he goes in and he sits, you know, in some sort of like clinical setting, and he has the people who are going to see him sort of line up one by one in front of him. It's this huge line of people. And the first person that he sees is this woman. And she says, you know, doctor, I really can't sleep. And he's like, okay, well, you know, I have a medication for that. So he writes a script and he hands it to her. And she said, I can't afford this medicine. I can barely afford to feed my children. You know, this is just not realistic for me. This is not going to solve my problem. And he's sort of like overwhelmed with like, how am I going to, you know, fix any of these people's problems? And, you know, she starts talking about how her insomnia is actually related to the fact that her husband was actually recently killed, and that, you know, now she's responsible for, you know, multiple children, and they have no income, and they're really, really struggling. They don't feel safe in the community because of like violence that's going on, a lot of crime. And so she starts to cry. And Dr. Barreto, sort of feeling a bit like hopeless, watches as this woman starts to, you know, experience what, you know, what ICT is all about, which is somebody from behind her comes over and starts to rub her back. And another person from behind her comes and offers her a cup of tea. And another person comes and gives her a chair and starts rubbing her feet. And a final person comes and starts saying, like, you know, the same thing happened to me. this is how I dealt with it. And so he watches the community sort of fold around her and provide these solutions for her that he wasn't, going to come up with. He had never experienced it. He didn't know the context. And so he's sort of watching the community offer these solutions that, a psychiatrist coming from outside of the community could never really meaningfully or authentically offer. And so that was sort of the moment when he decided, like, there's something else that needs to happen here that, like, me as psychiatrist, as prescriber, really can't provide. And so he started to design this model. And it's really fascinating to talk to him about it, because it took him like a decade to really fine tune the structure. But he basically just started by saying, like, hey, everybody, why don't we all just meet in like the local church? And he would sort of guide conversations, and they would kind of go badly, and he would have everything recorded on camera, and he would use it to sort of like go back and say, like, okay, this is where we need to make some changes. This is where, like, I've noticing some like structural weakness in how the session is facilitated. And so using those film sessions over time, he built this structure.
Every time I hear that story, I just get so touched by just thinking about the power of solidarity and support and shared life experience and, all of the things that we know break down loneliness and isolation and, the things that build up resilience and mental health. So it's really an amazing story for so many reasons, but also the thing that strikes me is the parallel to our society and the way we want to treat people is we want to write them a prescription, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we want people to deal with it on their own, right?
Yeah,
Like, you
yeah,
go, even getting the prescription, or like, you
yeah,
do
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, for physical ailments, for mental ailments, for all of the things, we want a pill. And like, not even just the medical system, but like the society, like, give me a pill, make it better, right?
Yeah.
And the reality is there is a ton of research on the factors that promote health and well-being, and that community support and solidarity is a huge factor in our health and well-being, both physical and mental. So I'm just curious for you now, going into psychiatry, right? And knowing the power of ICT, like, how are you kind of relating to that? I don't know if it's a dual role or dichotomy or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I mean, certainly it is, like, it's a dialectic, right? Like, there's like two thoughts that I have to hold in my mind at the same time, and they sometimes are opposing. But what I like to, and actually this is something that Dr. Bahetto talks about, is ICT is not a standalone solution for somebody who has a severe mental illness that needs to be treated with medication, but it is complementary. And the truth is, like, integrative community therapy, I think this is true of mindfulness as well, is not unique to someone who's experiencing like a pathological level of mental illness, right? It's not just for someone with bipolar disorder or someone with schizophrenia or someone with anxiety and depression. It's really for anybody. And it really teaches life skills. It's also why I say, like, anybody could benefit from a good course of dialectical behavioral therapy, because we're teaching skills that allow people to relate to themselves, relate to other people, and relate to sort of like their purpose and meaning in the world in a way that, like, you don't learn in school, and you 99% of the time don't learn from your family. And so we really, especially in the US, I would say, we don't end up learning a lot of these things organically. And so it has to come from somewhere, right? We have to learn it somewhere. And so it's these modalities, I think, that give us a structure, and also, like, take away the stigma of needing to learn these things, because like interpersonal effectiveness is something we all need to learn. And so I think it's unfortunately we need these structures because we don't embed these skills and this skill teaching into, the school system or into like every household in America. It's not on TV, right? Like we watch like reality TV because people are dysregulated and it's entertaining. We don't learn about like good coping skills through television. We learn like, chaos and drama are interesting. So we have to learn it somewhere. And so I think of ICT as sort of that place for anybody to learn how to have a meaningful conversation about things that cause emotional distress in anybody's life.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you are naming like mindfulness and DBT because that's been more the realm of what Awaken has done. But just to name that we have started incorporating ICT into what we do. And the way that I've been framing it for myself is that the mindfulness and the skill building we do, which looks a lot like some of DBT, it's not exactly that, but it parallels it greatly, is really that skill building. It's noticing, it's almost like cognitive behavioral therapy too, like noticing your thinking and saying to yourself, like, maybe that's not true, right? Maybe I could have a different thought. Maybe I don't need to follow that rabbit hole or whatever, right? And giving people that ability to just notice what might have not been fully conscious and make a different choice, right? And create some
Absolutely.
space in their reactivity, and their regulation. But I think the beauty, and that's a lot of internal work. Of
Mhm.
course, we do it in a group setting and we talk about things related to those practices in a group setting. But the beautiful flip of that coin, which is, mindfulness is a lot of inner work and kind of doing it on your own, then ICT brings that community of practice where people are really actively looking for healing together. Right. And so I
Yeah.
just I just find that they are so complementary. And then the other piece of that is ICT, and we haven't really talked about the structure of a session, but ICT asks the question like, what's happening with you personally right now? Share your story right now. Whereas mindfulness is more like, let's try this out, like here's a thing, like are you struggling with anger or fear or depression or whatever it is. Let's try out some skills to work with that, but ICT is really like the conversation. I don't know if you agree with that framing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, I think that the reason why they're so complementary to me is similar. It's sort of this idea that like we have to exercise some level of internal control in order to be able to safely and meaningfully be vulnerable in a group setting, and to name like what is going on with me and what I'm really struggling with, and have people even ask me questions about it, and then to offer me, it's not advice, right? Because we in ICT, we one of the sort of structural common agreements is that we don't give advice. We're not telling anybody what to do, but we do sort of talk about how we have lived in a similar experience and what we did in order to get through that. And so all of those touch points are based on this like internal reflection that, we have to, one, like remember what happened, which can be painful, sort of process a painful memory, think about how we can like productively engage with those painful memories in a way that gives us meaning and gives our story sort of like some brightness or some strength, and then offer that to a group. So all of that processing really relies on the ability that mindfulness offers, which is that like internal reflection, taking a second, right? Like a moment apart from to process and reflect. And so it's really like the evolution of that. Because you put yourself at risk, right? You open yourself up to other people, and you have to be able to handle what's coming at you. And the other thing I think that is really important about mindfulness in this space is just that there's going to be uncontrollable aspects in a community, right? So somebody might come in, and yes, we talk about us like structural common agreements or rules, but not everybody listens. Not everybody understands or internalizes the rules, and so it's not always like, it's not a super controlled setting. It is controlled to some degree, and the facilitator is responsible for sort of making sure that people feel protected to some degree. But there's always going to be some element of that we can't control. And so having a centeredness or a groundedness that allows you to sort of move through those moments of loss of control without losing the entire conversation or sort of shutting it down, that takes the skills that mindfulness provides. So I absolutely see them as complementary and sort of like essential to each other. And I think to go back to it, it's like the way that ICT feeds into mindfulness is then ICT gives people such a strong sense of like almost like accomplishment or strength for being able to demonstrate that vulnerability. And so you can go back and say like, okay, like how did I handle that? How did that go? What was my, takeaway from this? So I see them as absolutely feeding each other really beautifully in terms of like these skill sets that we're building for people.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. It yeah, really helped me understand something that I think I wasn't naming before about, the way that I described the awareness practice, right? The internal awareness that we're building through mindfulness being the first step to name something in the community setting. So
Absolutely.
I love that piece because I was thinking of it more feeding of ICT being used in a facilitation setting to help name the issues that we could then like bring mindfulness in to help, but I can really see it's more iterative than that, the way
Mhm.
that you were talking about it. Yeah, I really like that. That's awesome. Yeah, and you were naming vulnerability in what you were saying there. And I know any kind of inner work we do can be raw and vulnerable and emotional, and to name that in community can be hard. But there's also this piece of that where when we are fully seen and heard, right? That there is such a relief and joy to that. Um, yeah, so I guess I wonder if you have had experience where it's that, yes, it could be scary to share something. Yes, it can be very raw and vulnerable, but there's also the other piece of that, that when it gets validated, when you feel seen and heard, there's such a relief or joy.
This reminds me of actually a really recent round that we did at the American Psychiatric Association. We had a learning lab session, and we had something like 30 participants show up, which at one of these conferences is like, wow, that's a lot of people. So and you're always like, oh my gosh, are we gonna like, how's this gonna go? Again, sort of this element of like lack of control. But there was one woman who came who was I believe she was a medical student, like a fourth year medical student. And she just told this incredible story about how she had been she went into medical school as this like super achiever, and just trying to do the most, just like be part of every club, and ace all her tests, and just do everything all the time. And at some point she came down with long COVID that like really severely impacted her capacity and her ability to function. She had to take time off, and it just like completely reconfigured her identity in a really, really painful way for a while because she couldn't define herself as like a doer anymore. So she really, really struggled with this. And as she's telling this story, she starts as being sort of like not defiant, but feeling, you can tell she's sort of guarded, and that this is like a painful story that she might not have told a whole lot of people. And by the end, when she's talking about, sort of rediscovering who she is, not based on what she does, but sort of like just by who she really is at her core, she's crying. And everyone in the room was a mess. And, it really emphasized for me how meaningful it is to be given the space to tell your story. And while she was telling it, right? Like, I don't think that she had written this down before. I don't know that she had told the story in this, certainly not in this public of a setting or in like a narrative arc. And so, coming from this super vulnerable origin to like this, allowing us to watch her arc of like a hero's journey towards this like place of strength, it just really it's so powerful to watch somebody do that in real time. And then afterwards, we're all sitting there like, oh my God, like you're a hero, right? And so to give that validation to somebody who hasn't been able to really get this painful story off of their chest before, I think it really speaks to what you're saying, which is just this validation that she at the end, at the beginning of the session, she had been, like I said, sort of guarded, and I think sort of skeptical about the model and like what we were all doing there. And by the end, she was like, how do I get involved? Like, I want to learn more about this method. Like, who are you people? How did you get that out of me? And so, and I think I have seen that play out throughout my time with ICT. Sometimes it feels a little bit like magic because the structure like flows sort of mysteriously in the background. You're not even like really paying attention. And then all of a sudden everybody's crying.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That is beautiful. And I love in that story that people named to her that they saw her as heroic. That's just very beautiful. Because when you're in the middle of something like that, you just feel the struggle,
Yeah.
right? And you don't see you don't see yourself like as a heroic
Yeah,
person for
absolutely.
overcoming, the
Yes.
difficulty.
I think that's why we don't tell those stories, right? Like, not only do we not have the space, but we're also like, I don't want to, like, I don't know that I did anything right or wrong. Maybe I'm still not doing the right thing. Maybe I should be doing something better or more. And so yeah, to just hear it from others who also, can connect too, right? Like a similar context, somebody who's been in training, who you also like have gone through that moment of distress. Like, am I just all of the things that I do, or am I like something more than that? So to be able to give that validation back to her, I think is also just, it's part of the magic.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Yeah. Well, shifting topics just slightly, for people listening, Visible Hands Collaborative and Awaken Pittsburgh are integrating with one another more deeply. And we are hoping to really be able to bring ICT into the other community and organization contexts that we've been working in, like schools and workplaces and family-based programming, etc. And so I'm just curious how you see the implementation of ICT, and maybe it's a naive question, but like how do you view ICT coming into a place like a school for educators or a workplace for colleagues to be in conversations like that, or a group of parents that are struggling with parenting, something like that.
I have imagined ICT in all of these settings at different points, because I think that it does naturally sort of lend itself to any community context. And so particularly with schools, this has come up a lot as something that, you know, especially when there's national crises or things that are going on at a community level or a broader level that we often struggle to talk with kids about at home or as teachers. Giving this space that ICT gives to open up people to each other's vulnerabilities, um, especially in schools. I think with like high schoolers and middle school, I think would be like the most appropriate, just because they can sort of like gauge a little bit more of the social context and follow community rules, that kind of thing. But being able to provide like that safer space, um, to talk about struggles that we share, I think is really where the ICT's value comes in there. Workplaces, certainly. We have already been implementing ICT in some healthcare settings, but helping people who face a lot of workplace trauma. If something like a patient passes away or commits suicide or something to that level, having a space for people to come together and talk about how that's impacted them, and sort of like what are some of the ways in which we can learn from each other to cope with these challenges or lean on each other to get through some of the harder times. And so, those are just a couple of settings I think that ICT really offers a lot of value and opportunity for just bringing up dialogue around things that can be really hard and painful. And when you want to talk about these things, it's like, oh, like what if we get off track, or what if somebody has um you know it hits somebody harder than somebody else. Like I think there's like a lot of ambiguity about how you have these conversations, and so ICT really offers this like really lovely structure to do it in a way that leads people in the conversation to a positive place, or like not necessarily always positive, but like one of hopefulness as opposed to hopelessness, which I think can also be one of the risks of having difficult conversations with groups.
Yeah, I like that idea that it brings more hope. That really, especially like you said, when you're dealing with a community that has experienced a trauma, right? Or ongoing community trauma, right? When
Mhm.
you have a
Yeah.
community that, as in the example from Brazil, right? Folks that are having ongoing trauma
Yeah.
that you could build not just the space itself to do the sharing, but like my hope, and maybe you could speak to this, is that after that, that community that's already kind of organically together because they either live in the same space or they're all in the same school, that it's going to shift the culture a little to
Yeah.
more care and concern and solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the goals of ICT, and we actually see it play out in Fortaleza, where Dr. Barreto started ICT, is, from building these connections that come from being vulnerable in a group. um, there's a safety net, there's a social safety net that gets built in that then leads to like community building, and not just in a interpersonal sense, but also in like a physical sense. And so in Pirambu, the favela, they ended up like building up a community center around ICT, and then they started building like brick homes around the community center. And so these like very tangible social benefits of what it looks like when these social connections play out over time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that, and I hope that us working together starts to manifest some of that in areas of our, not just Pittsburgh, but in other places that really, really could use the support. That's my hope.
Yeah, and I think, I guess the bottom line is like ICT isn't just to have ICT rounds, right? The goal is actually to build these networks and to strengthen community. And so whatever that looks like, that the community decides is right. It's not like ICT is going to offer those solutions, but it does create the connections and sort of the context of like, hey, like you and I struggle with the same situation. Like what are some solutions that we can come up with together around this?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, just as we're winding down here, Alice, was there anything that you were hoping to talk about on the podcast that I didn't ask about? Was there anything in your mind that you were like, I hope she asks me that? Or I really want to be sure to say this.
I think one other story that I really like to tell, because it was
Sure.
really early on, but it just was so powerful. I always come back to it. And then I do want to talk a little bit about some of the like team members that we have. It's specifically like Sylvia and Nyeka, but all of the trainers that we've worked with. So first, the story. It's really incredible moment. Okay, so this was when I was actually joining the European virtual rounds. And so I was just a participant. I wasn't like training anybody. I wasn't, I didn't really know what ICT was yet. So I was just kind of a participant. And I believe that that day, the theme that was chosen was around the George Floyd protests and what had happened with George Floyd, and how there were a couple of other people on the Zoom that day who were from the US. And so we each, from the US kind of spoke about our perspective and, how it was, how we were being impacted by what had played out and, George Floyd's murder and like all of these things that were just like exquisitely painful. And, I think as somebody from the US, I certainly have this like United States-based centrism where I'm like, oh, our struggles are just so unique and they, these types of things don't happen anywhere else. Like this is a type of pain that like doesn't happen in the places where, all of these people on the internet right now are from. So I have to explain it to them. And boy, was I corrected when one of the women who was originally, so she was from Scotland, but her family was Irish, and she grew up um, dating a Catholic Irish boy who had been actually murdered when she was like 14 in a bombing. And she spoke about this experience and this trauma just with such like global perspective in a way that I had not actually spoken with anybody about outside of the US, about, sort of like hatred and bias and bigotry and how these things like tear these communities apart. Um, and what she did about it to sort of like face this trauma was to start an annual fundraiser for like an organization that does like peace work. And she started doing this at like age 14 when it happened. And it was just like this incredible perspective giving story that also showed like what is possible and how we overcome and all of the things, all the incredible things that humans can do to face these like really, really painful and like universal experiences, right? Universally uh, atrocious experiences, unfortunately. But like that she had faced it with such strength and such poise and like, really did something about it. I just was really just so incredibly moved. And it was one of the moments that I thought to myself, like, this is such an important model because it allows for things like this to come out in places where, I would never have heard these stories before. And so just being able to acknowledge like how people's experiences, very unique experiences, really powerful experiences can come out in these groups really showed me the strength of the ICT model that I don't think I've ever really seen anywhere else. Because, then somebody else shared their story and we all, ended with from a place of hope. So I really love that story. I love to tell it. It's one of the things that I think about all the time when I'm doing ICT. Um, and then the other thing that I mentioned was just that we have had such an incredible experience with working with these international partners, and we truly could not have done it without them. And so, I mentioned Ricardo and Megan Patterson Brown in Switzerland. But we've also worked with Sylvia London and Nika Rodriguez out of Mexico City, and they are still deeply involved in the work that we do. They are our trainers. They have come to visit Pennsylvania multiple times to do trainings, and they do lots of virtual work. And I have just learned so much from them, about ideas of solidarity and about like how to make these conversations really come through, how to make people feel like they can be vulnerable in these spaces. And then, of course, Dr. Barreto and his team, Victoria Barreto, who is his niece, but also one of his like primary trainers. They have just been incredibly kind and patient and warm towards us as we are like, trying to figure out how to get this model out from, this in this reverse osmosis way, right? Because we're so used to, as the Western world, saying like, oh, we did all the research, we did all the development, we have all the money, we'll share that with you, we're going to teach you something. But to be on the receiving end of that and like really, really be humbled in the ways in which we have so much to learn about being in community and being vulnerable in community spaces and how you organize these things and how much time it takes and effort and love that goes into this type of work. So so all of, that's our community, that's the ICT community. And so I just have to shout them out because it's just been such an important part of how all of this came to be and how it will go forward.
I love that. And I also love the image of like, yeah, like the US, we are very arrogant sometimes, right? About feeling like we're the most advanced or we have it all figured out. But actually, like our hyper individualism prevents us from seeing sometimes the value of the more relational cultural way of being that comes out of Latin America, that comes out of like Southern European cultures, and many, many others that I'm not naming, but that, I think they're sometimes called high context cultures, that really we can learn a little bit from, and this is a beautiful, beautiful example of that. So thank you for naming that. I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
I'm married to a Latino, and my dad's from Southern
Yeah.
Italy. So I really feel like, living in both worlds kind of person myself. I really feel like sometimes we as North Americans miss that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's to our detriment, right? Like
Yes.
and
Yes.
we don't name it, right? We just kind of live it, and it's the water that we're swimming in. And so having it named for me by, all of these people all over the world has just been like such an important lesson in terms of what do humans really need to thrive, to survive all of the crazy stuff that happens to us. And it's each other that is that's the answer ICT provides.
I love it. I love it. I think that's a great place to stop. But I have
Yeah.
one more question before we wrap
Okay.
it up. And it's a question that I ask absolutely everyone on the podcast. Are there any resources, maybe just one, that you could share with the listeners that, now you're basically ready to launch your career in psychiatry. You're finishing up your residency and all that. So is there any particular resource that you could share that would be something to support mental health and well-being and the people's journey in that?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess first I should name our website. I don't know
Oh
if
yeah,
that's
totally. We'll link to
okay.
the Visible Hands website. There's so much on that website that's amazing. Yeah, thank you for
There are
naming
a lot of
that.
resources there. And then we did actually translate the Integrative Community Therapy Handbook from Dr. Barreto's original Portuguese publication. And so that's a really great place to learn more about ICT. It describes really in depth the model, but also the sort of like theory and philosophy behind it. So certainly check that out.
Is that
I
links on the website as well?
believe so. That is a good question. Can
Okay,
I?
we'll see if maybe we can find it.
And then I talked about DBT because I really believe in it. And so DBT resources abound. I
Yeah.
would look at
Which for folks who may not know, it's dialectical behavioral therapy. And there are so many workbooks, all kinds of stuff. If you Google dialectical behavioral therapy and whatever else, you'll probably find a workbook like DBT for anxiety, DBT for OCD, DBT for whatever it is.
There's one that actually my psychotherapy supervisor suggested, which is called dbtselfhelp.com. If
Oh,
you're
cool.
new and you just want to learn about DBT, I highly recommend that resource. What else? I could go on. I think one of the biggest influences that has impacted my career is Girl Interrupted.
Oh,
That book really really informed my understanding of like the experience of mental illness. um Really, it's a classic. But I think I must have read it at the beginning of residency. But just a really interesting look into sort of how hard it is to be out there with mental illness. And also, we love to see how far we've come, because certainly we're not hospitalizing people the same way that we used to. So that's good.
yeah. Well, this has been lovely. I really appreciate you taking the time to hop on the call with me and share, your experiences. It's been really lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for having me. It's been so great.
Yeah.
Say Something Studios.